West African transit route feeds the European cocaine market, which in recent years grew fourfold, reaching an amount almost equal to the US market.
Controlling threats of organised crime in West Africa and keeping watch on complacency over HIV.
The main thing is not to let AIDS disappear from the screen. We can't let that happen because then the epidemic will explode back in our faces.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
Hello and thanks for joining us once again. We'll also take a look at the dark side of new internet domain extensions. But first, we heard quite a bit last week about the threat of starvation in Africa's Sahel region. This week, organised crime is threatening the already fragile peace, security and stability in the West African region. At a meeting hosted by Togo, the country's president, Faure Essozimna Ganasingbe, said more resources and a greater commitment from the international community are needed. Secretary General of the UN Ban Ki-moon told ambassadors that while the UN has been helping in the region, the upheaval in Libya is having side effects, such as an influx of weapons. He also said a growing food crisis rooted in drought currently affects millions and has raised fears that the situation could worsen further still. Julie Walker reports.
Whether it's trafficking of illegal drugs or arms or people, organized crime is on the rise in West Africa and in the Sahel region and must be stopped, according to Togo's president, Faure Essozimna Ganasingbe, who says peace and security in the region, already hard hit by conflict, strife and food shortages, is at stake.
Transnational organized crime is a source of major concern for the countries of West Africa and the Sahel. It is a major obstacle to development of the economies of our states, to the degree that security issues mobilize major intellectual, human and financial resources which should have been invested in development.
One of the main illegal activities is drugs. The head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Yuri Fedotov, says for these criminals, West Africa represents the shortest and most cost-effective channel for trafficking of drugs, especially cocaine, to Europe.
The West African transit route feeds the European cocaine market, which in recent years grew fourfold, reaching an amount almost equal to the US market. We estimate that cocaine trafficking in West and Central Africa generates some $800 million annually.
That's more than the gross domestic product of some of the West African and Sahel region nations. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says additional resources and funding, along with continued political commitment, is needed to fight the criminal activity, which could end up including terrorist organizations.
Terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb have begun to form alliances with the drug traffickers and other criminal syndicates. Such alliances have the potential to further destabilize the region and reverse hard-won democratic and peace-building achievements.
Ban says the UN has already begun to build transitional crime units, but it's merely the beginning of what must be done. Ganasingbe warns if not, there could be dire circumstances.
A lack of coordinated action could lead to violence and the destruction of the hard-earned gains of recent years. This is also the price of the development of our countries.
Ganasingbe wants to form an international contact group on organized transnational crime, and Ban Ki-moon suggests a regional summit of Gulf of Guinea heads of state to be convened as early as possible.
Julie Walker with that report. There are some nations that are a hotbed for cyber fraud and internet scams, and soon the situation might get worse. Forget .com, soon it'll be .anything you can think of, and with that will come a lot of cyber squatting and other domain name disputes. The World Intellectual Property Organization is already responsible for the protection of intellectual properties throughout the world, and now will also resolve disputes involving rights to a domain name. It was given this new role by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, otherwise known as ICANN, which is allowing the new array of Internet domain endings. The World Intellectual Property Organization's Brian Beckham explains what it all means.
What that means for the average Internet user is basically we'll be going from the current naming space, which is your familiar .com, .org, .edu extensions, along with the country codes like .uk, .fr, .ch, to virtually a limitless domain name space. So really, the sky's the limit in terms of what the applicants want to apply for. If they think there's going to be, a significance for internet users in having a sort of specific piece of internet real estate that means something, and then they'll be able to sell second-level domains in that space. So you could have, for example, pizza.nyc or, username.brand. So really, the sky's the limit. And, it's an interesting process that holds a lot of possible promise for, changing the way we find things online. And, of course, how this all interplays with social networks and search engines is anybody's guess, and that'll develop over time.
What mainly is the World Intellectual Properties Organization's concern over ICANN's new naming conventions?
I think looking back in the rearview mirror a little bit, it's useful to understand the history of WIPO's engagement in the domain name system. So prior to ICANN's formation, there was a white paper put out by the United States government and a call by member states of WIPO to look at the problem of cyber squatting on the internet. So in the early days, you would have this sort of traditional form of cyber squatting would be an unrelated entity registering a .brand, a McDonald's.com or Nike.com, and basically holding out for ransom that domain name until the brand owner would pay up. So basically, to come up with a solution outside of the courts to address this problem of cyber squatting, WIPO recommended a dispute resolution process, which is commonly known as the UDRP, which allows parties from the world over to file a dispute with an accredited dispute resolution provider to, under a certain set of well-known circumstances, retrieve a domain name from a cyber squatter. So that's going back 10 years ago, and what we have now is, still year on year, short of a slight dip a couple of years ago for the economic slump, we see a fairly steady increase in the number of cases filed with the WIPO Arbitration and Mediation Center to address the cyber squatting that's still going on today. And it's something that, the practices have evolved. So whereas in the past you would have this sort of domain names held out for ransom, now you have different types of pay-per-click, arrangements, or different fraud where the domain name would be used for phishing or other types of fraud. So, we see that the bad guys are not going away, and so I think the fundamental concern is that in a new domain space, which is virtually unlimited, that there are additional rights protection mechanisms for trademark owners to be able to tackle not only the existing types of practices that might be proliferated in new domains, but also new unknown, bad acts that abuse their brands.
What role will WIPO take in terms of the disputes over these names?
WIPO's engagement within the ICANN process most recently sort of revolved around a proposal in early 2009 for a legal rights objection procedure for brand owners to be able to object to an application where they would feel that application might infringe their brand at the top level. And so that was adopted by ICANN, and WIPO will be the exclusive provider of disputes under this process. We're expecting that the first objections could be filed as early as May of this year, when ICANN announces all of the applications which have been received and are administratively compliant. And there's an objection window for about 7 months, so we're looking to approximately December of this year when all of the objections would be known, and then there's a dispute resolution process where we would appoint an external trademark expert to decide the dispute.
That's Brian Beckham of the World Intellectual Property Organization discussing the can of worms soon to be opened by the future establishment of new domain extensions on the internet. Developing countries are being urged to stay on track in the fight against HIV and AIDS, or else the epidemic will again explode. That's according to the UN Joint Programme on HIV and AIDS. Over the past decade, the number of new HIV infections has decreased by 20%, but donor fatigue, coupled with a global apathy when it comes to HIV and AIDS, could threaten this progress. Patrick Magua has been speaking to UNAIDS Deputy Director Paul DeLay.
We have some major successes that we should be aware of, that we should celebrate. The number of new infections per year is down over 20% over this last decade. We have close to 6.6 million people on antiretroviral drugs. We're seeing a decreased number of infections in babies passed by their mothers. So these are all markers of success, but the underlying message is that we still are not moving fast enough, and these successes are not strong enough. If we continue at this same rate, this same scale, we envision that this epidemic could be with us for another 40 to 50 years.
You were recently quoted as saying developing countries need to take charge of managing the HIV/AIDS pandemic. What has led to this new way of thinking?
This is a realization that's come about because of a number of different dynamic forces that we are seeing in the world today. The fiscal crisis that started in 2008 continues to affect international spending on development, and it continues to affect domestic spending on social sectors. We're also seeing other priorities. The AIDS epidemic is one of many social priorities, and how do we put that into perspective? We're also seeing major funding institutions like the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, which has provided a major amount of funding to Africa and to other countries throughout the world. They're going through their own economic problems, and they're having trouble replenishing themselves. So we're seeing that the funding is fragile. And one of the things that we see, particularly for the AIDS epidemic, is that in Africa, for instance, close to 60% of the funding for both prevention and treatment comes from international sources, from major donors, from the Global Fund. This is true in Asia, where it's about 50-50, 50% coming from the international community. And when we see a problem like the Global Fund is having, countries are starting to become aware of the dependency that they have on these international funders who may not be consistent, who may not be reliable as far as ongoing funding, and a recognition that there needs to be a sense of a shared responsibility, that governments need to be able to step in if people's lives are in danger, if drug stockouts are happening, to be able to step forward and ensure that people who are on treatment continue to receive it, and those who are not on it but need it are able to be added to the clinic registries and be started on treatment. People who are on AIDS treatment are on it for life. So we're talking about people taking drugs for 20, 30, 40 years. So what would be the funding sources? What would be the sources of these drugs, not 5 years from now, but 10 years, 20 years from now?
You've said the political system is running away from the AIDS issue and looking at other priorities. Are you concerned that HIV/AIDS is no longer a political issue?
Yes, we are. In fact, we are seeing what we call AIDS fatigue, 30 years of this epidemic. There are other problems, political problems, wars, conflict, post-conflict situations, elections, changes in government, natural disasters, and we need to maintain the focus on AIDS, but it also has to be in perspective, and we have to recognize that countries do have other priorities. The main thing is not to let AIDS disappear from the screen, from the attention of the leaders, from the attention of the social sectors that provide the services. We can't let that happen, because then the epidemic will explode back in our faces.
Paul DeLay there, ending that report by Patrick Magua.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
According to a new human rights report, The Israeli authorities have shown contempt for the law and decency in their treatment of a Palestinian prisoner, Kader Adnan, who has been refusing food for almost 2 months in protest at his imprisonment without charge by Israel. Richard Falk is a UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in occupied Palestine and has been speaking to Reem Abaza. She asked him how Kader Adnan was doing.
The latest information that we have indicates that his bodily functions suggest a very serious danger of death, and he remains unwilling to break his hunger strike. He continues to object to the conditions under which he was put in this kind of administrative detention.
He's under what is called administrative detention. What is it exactly, and is it legal under international law?
It does seem to be a violation of international humanitarian law with respect to individuals who are charged with some kind of security offense while under occupation. There is a limited option of an emergency kind of detention, but there's an obligation to show that there really is an emergency, and Mr. Adnan has been denied any kind of access to the information relating to what he is charged with. There's no disclosure by the Israelis. They rely on secret information, and they contend that it's justified to keep him in detention for this 4-month period with no charges. It certainly is a violation of international human rights law and a general moral sense of treating every civilian with a measure of dignity that is certainly missing in the way he was treated. From the moment of arrest, he was rather violently arrested in his home at 3:30 in the morning and taken by a large group of Israeli soldiers that visibly beat him in the presence of his young children and wife. Totally unacceptable, unlawful, and disgraceful show of Israeli contempt for law and decency in their treatment of a Palestinian.
But what prompted the Israeli authorities to arrest him in the first place?
Well, we don't know beyond their contention that he was in some sense posing a security threat, but they haven't given any evidence. He has been arrested in the past. He served 6 years in prison, and he obviously is a resistor to the occupation, but as far as I've been able to determine, he has not engaged, nor is he accused of engaging in violent acts. So there doesn't seem to be a basis either for claiming a security emergency, and certainly there's no basis for the abusive treatment that he has received.
He's been on hunger strike for 60 days now. What are the responsibilities that have to be fulfilled by the Israeli authorities towards him?
I think there's no option other than to release him at this stage and allow him to receive medical treatment. He also was denied visitation rights by his family. His wife pleaded to visit him, and this was denied by an Israeli judicial body. So the whole case exhibits oppressive injustice at its very worst, and there is no excuse for holding him in his present condition under administrative detention.
You're calling also on the international community to intervene, to do something. What do you want them to do?
Well, I think the most effective action at this point is for governments that are friendly to Israel, starting with the U.S. government, to exert both public and private pressure in a manner that shows that they really mean it, and to make the situation immediately as visible as possible so that pressure is produced from below and above.
Special UN Rapporteur Richard Falk speaking about a Palestinian prisoner's human rights in Israel.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
Back to West Africa now, and thousands of children in Chad will die of malnutrition if assistance is not provided on time. That's according to the United Nations Children's Fund. Chad is one of the many countries in the Sahel region which is facing a serious food crisis as a result of chronic drought, poor harvests, and rising food prices. UNICEF says the severe food and nutrition crisis in Chad is expected to continue until the end of the hunger season in October this year. To find out more about this food crisis, Derek Mabata spoke with UNICEF representative in Chad, Bruno Meyers.
UNICEF and the nutrition cluster estimates that around 127,000 children aged 6 to 59 months will be affected by severe acute malnutrition in 2012, and this in the Sahel belt of Chad. On December 21st, 2011, the government of Chad has officially declared an anticipated nutrition crisis in the Sahel belt of Chad.
Is there a threat of children dying of malnutrition in Chad now?
Yeah, if we don't do anything from now, we estimate that 127,000 children will die. 127,000 children the age of 6 to 59 months. And the total number of children in the Sahel band, it's 1,100,000 under 5.
Now tell me, Mr. Mas, what is UNICEF doing to help these vulnerable children in Chad?
Basically, the first key action is to ensure a treatment of children with severe acute malnutrition. Last year, we had around 223 UNICEF-supported nutritional centers for treatment of severe acute malnutrition in the Sahel band. But this year we will have to increase and expand the number of therapeutic nutritional centers to ensure a better coverage. We hope to go up to 270 nutritional centers, and this will be translated in ensuring that all the therapeutic milk, essential medicine and ready-use therapeutic food are procured and distributed on time. UNICEF is also providing technical and financial support as well as surge capacity for the treatment of severe acute malnutrition.
Tell me about the $2.2 million that the UN Central Emergency Response Fund allocated to UNICEF to assist children there.
For 2011, 223 UNICEF nutritional centers were operational due to the significant support of the Central Emergency Response Fund. Around 68,600 children were admitted for treatment of severe acute malnutrition in these 223 therapeutic feeding centers. Nearly 7,000 received inpatient care, while outpatient care was provided to the rest.
How are these children now?
These children survived due to this appropriate treatment. The operation was a success, and in coordination with World Food Programme, who was also providing support for the management of moderate acute malnutrition.
What should be done to ensure sustainability of food security, particularly for children in Chad?
Well, the climate conditions for this year are definitely not favorable to good cereal production. According to the Ministry of Agriculture, World Food Programme and FAO, there is a gap of minimum 20% on the total cereal production in Chad, which is about 455,000 metric tons, and between 30 to 80%, more specifically, in the Sahel belt of Chad, compared to the average production during the last 5 years. Currently, livestock is also threatened by a severe fodder shortage in early 2012. And the situation is further aggravated by the influx of over 80,000 Chadians from Libya who arrived here in mid-2011. And this is also a factor strongly affecting the Sahel region. According to the World Food Programme, Chadian families are already becoming more indebted and selling off personal possessions as they cope with the loss of remittance from Libya.
So Chad is going to continue to need international support.
Definitively, Chad will not be able to cope without international solidarity and humanitarian action.
When it comes to drinking coffee, we all know the stimulating effect it can have, but a new study by the National Institutes of Health in the US has discovered that coffee can also strengthen a particular region of the brain, which affects learning and memory. Wally Akinso has more.
When drinking coffee, many coffee lovers feel mentally refreshed or stimulated. And now, according to an NIH study in rats, that stimulation happens in a particular part of the brain.
Caffeine in concentrations comparable to a large cup of coffee can strengthen connections in a part of the brain called the hippocampus and a part of the hippocampus called CA2.
Dr. Serena Dudek is the senior author of this NIH study.
The hippocampus is a part of the brain. It's a structure that's known to be important for learning and memory. And the CA2 is a little part of the hippocampus that really hasn't been studied much at all.
Once the rats were given caffeine, researchers measured the strength of nerve cells' electrical messages in brain tissue.
The caffeine caused an enhancement of the synaptic responses. And almost immediately in the case of the brain slices, we then characterized the cellular mechanisms of this enhancement.
According to Dr. Dudek, the study showed that the higher the caffeine dose, the stronger the effect in the CA2 region of the brain.
Caffeine enhances synaptic connections in this one particular part of the brain at concentrations that really don't do anything elsewhere. And so we think that this is where caffeine is working.
Dr. Dudek adds that the CA2 region is likely to be a key site where cognitive function is modulated by the time of day.
Wally Akinso reporting there from Bethesda, Maryland. And that is The World for this week. If you want to learn more about the program or wish to make a contribution to the show, then please visit us at www.theworldradioshow.com. From there, you can subscribe to the podcast and also access our Facebook page to join the discussion on any of the topics raised in this program. The World is committed to bringing you stories that affect the people of our planet, either on a mass or individual scale. And we hope to do so with balance and integrity. As always, we welcome your comments and your suggestions, so please do keep in touch via www.theworldradioshow.com. The program is produced and compiled by Tim Stackpool, and I look forward to your company next time. Until then, bye for now.